What ho, good YouTubers! I'm Dan, and welcome to the 80's Emporium, a magical faraway land where it's always the 1980s. The 80s in America. A time of acid-washed jeans and neon leg warmers, boomboxes and arcade games, new Coke and sliced soda. And on the big screen, it was also a time of swords and sorcery. For our purposes, the term swords and sorcery refers to fantasy action dramas that take place in fantastic lands, where magic is real, horses are the fastest form of transportation, and the weapon of choice is a blade. In these stories, heroes embark on epic quests in order to save their worlds from great evil, usually with minimal clothing. The swords and sorcery genre experienced a large increase in popularity during the 1980s. Before we delve into our favorite S&S films of the 1980s, let's look at some of the reasons this phenomenon came to be. The first and most notable factor was the popularity of Dungeons & Dragons, a fantasy-based role-playing game that was introduced in 1974. D&D really took off in the 80s and has continued to grow to this day. In fact, a 2017 survey estimated that there are 12 to 15 million D&D players in North America. Another contributing factor was the success of a 1977 space epic that you may have heard of. The massive and unexpected success of Star Wars influenced all fantasy genres, including this one, as we will see. One of the first sword and sorcery entries of the decade was a short film called Black Angel. This project was actually commissioned by George Lucas to play before The Empire Strikes Back in European theaters. The director of the short, Roger Christian, had actually won an Oscar for his set decoration on Star Wars: A New Hope. While largely forgotten, this short was a major influence on many of the films of the decade, such as Excalibur and Legend. Sadly, after Empire's run, the prints to Black Angel were lost, until they were found 34 years later in a World War II bunker in the UK. We've noticed a number of similar themes that occur throughout these films, and we'll provide a quick cheat sheet or scroll as we introduce each film. These include the use of swords, damsels in distress, the title being the hero's name, an evil witch or wizard, a magical jewel, the main character wearing minimal clothing, people turning into animals, and ferrets, which admittedly only appear in one movie. We will also denote how each film did both financially and critically.
We shall see.
Hawk the Slayer.
Hawk the Slayer, which starred John Terry of Lost fame and Academy Award winner Jack Palance, featured a fellowship of sorts, which included a witch, an elf, a dwarf, and a giant. Sound familiar? But Hawk the Slayer, while widely unremembered today, was an important influence on subsequent films in the subgenre. Poor reviews ended a planned franchise before it could get started.
Excalibur.
While the swords and sorcery genre experienced a rebirth in the 80s, its roots can be traced all the way back to England in the 5th and 6th centuries, during the time of the legendary character King Arthur. Since the dawn of the motion picture, there have been a number of projects based on Arthurian characters. One such project was 1981's Excalibur, which featured Liam Neeson, Patrick Stewart, and Helen Mirren, for whom this was a breakout role. The film was very successful, and was even nominated for Best Cinematography at the '82 Oscars.
Clash of the Titans.
2 months later, MGM and United Artists took a page out of Greek mythology for their fantasy adventure Clash of the Titans. Starring Harry Hamlin as Perseus and Laurence Olivier as Zeus, the film also featured the final work from legendary stop-motion animator Ray Harryhausen. It was one of the most successful films of the year and had international appeal as well. Unfortunately, it came out the same day as, which stole much of the spotlight.
Dragonslayer.
A joint production between Paramount and Disney, Dragonslayer was the most ambitious sword and sorcery production to date, with 25% of the film's budget going toward the creation of a dragon. To bring that creation to life, the filmmakers turned to the newly formed Industrial Light and Magic, the effects company behind Star Wars. Dragonslayer was nominated for Best Visual Effects at the Academy Awards. Dragonslayer would receive good reviews from critics, but it was not financially successful.
The consequences of failure.
What failure?
But it would go on to have a cult following and inspire storytellers, such as Guillermo del Toro and George R.R. Martin.
The Sword and the Sorcerer.
1982's The Sword and the Sorcerer was a box office success, earning 10 times its $4 million budget and becoming one of the highest-grossing indie films of the 1980s. But it is largely remembered for one thing and one thing only: the hero's sword, which has not one blade, but three.
What have we here?
And that's not all. The unusual weapon can actually shoot out blades, and even has a fourth blade hidden in its handle. The end credits promised a sequel, but that promise was never realized until 2010. That's right, director Albert Pyun returned 28 years later to helm Tales of an Ancient Empire. Despite major production issues and scathing reviews, he did make good on his promise.
Conan the Barbarian.
Arguably the most famous and certainly the most successful 80s film in the genre was Conan the Barbarian. Director John Milius co-wrote the script with Oliver Stone, based on the comic book character introduced in 1932. The titular barbarian was brought to life by a young actor and bodybuilder named Arnold Schwarzenegger. The role skyrocketed him into international stardom and successful careers in both entertainment and politics. The success of Conan pushed the swords and sorcery genre from a fad to a phenomenon.
Have you ever felt such a wind?
If you're enjoying this video, the best way to support us is by purchasing some of our exclusive merchandise on our online shop.
The Beastmaster.
3 months after Conan the Barbarian, we met the Beastmaster. Mark Singer starred as a hero who could communicate with animals, particularly a team consisting of an eagle, 2 ferrets, and a tiger, who was painted black.
What do you think?
Along with actress Tanya Roberts, they faced off against Rip Torn's evil sorcerer. While it wasn't a big hit at the time of release, it did gain popularity on cable. In fact, it was shown so often in the mid-80s that some joked that TBS and HBO stood for the Beastmaster station and, hey, Beastmaster's on. The film led to 2 sequels and a 1999 TV show, which ran for 3 seasons and guest starred an older singer in a supporting role. Strangely enough, Tanya Roberts would go on to star in her own movie, where she could talk to animals, only 2 years later, in Sheena. Check out our 80s superhero episode for more about that film. That's it for part 1 of Swords and Sorcery of the 1980s. In part 2, we'll discuss the female-led Red Sonja, Dolph Lundgren's portrayal of He-Man in Masters of the Universe, the first leading role for Tom Hanks, why Schwarzenegger hated the sequel to Conan, and more. Don't miss it. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.